All right, everyone, welcome to the 2021 Virtual Christmas Summit brought to you by Boscoyo Studio. This presentation is sponsored by Build a Light Show. Please don't unmute or interrupt the presenter, but feel free to put any questions you have or any discussions you want to have in the chat. This is Sequencing 101 presented by Barry Wiles. This presentation is for the beginning sequencer to learn the basics of sequencing in xLights. Be sure to come back and join Barry here at 7 p.m. Eastern Standard Time for Sequencing 201. And with that, we will hand it over to Barry
All right,
to
let
get
me
started.
share my screen here. All right, I'd like to thank everybody for attending the presentation. And as this goes along, if you have questions, you can post them in chat, and we'll try to answer them at the end. Or if you have questions at the end of the presentation, I think they have a way for you to raise your hand, and we can chat there. So I'd like to thank all the other sponsors and the people who have tirelessly put this together. This is a great experience for everybody. It's an honor for me to kick off the sequencing side of things. You guys have some really great resources coming up today. People that are some of the best people I've looked up to in sequencing, doing some classes. So I think this is going to be a great resource for a lot of people. As I said, I am kind of attacking this as a kind of a sequencing 101. So what we're going to do is basically talk about the basics of being and creating a sequence, and kind of how to get through the beginnings of it. One thing I'll let you know now, in case you want to do it while we're talking, if you go to the website, sequencesol.com, there's a little button up here called Virtual Christmas. If you hit that, you can come down here and download the sequence that I'm going to actually be using today for the class. It's free. You don't have to sign up for anything. I don't collect any of your information. It's strictly a resource for you, or when this class is done, go grab it. It'll allow you to kind of see some of the concepts we are talking about here in the class, so that you can learn more and get more out of the experience. So what we're going to cover in this class, this afternoon, or this morning, or like I said, evening, depending on where you're at, a little bit about how to set up xLights for a sequence. I'm going to talk a little bit about my thought process when I look into a sequence, and go through kind of timing marks, color, a little bit of sequence views, and then some of the basic effects. And like I said, go out to the website. That'll get you to that sequence um, that you can download. So who am I? I live in Land O'Lakes, Florida. I'm very fortunate. There's a lot of great lighting people in Florida. I've done a personal light show for going on 11 years now. I started like a lot of people did in the Lightorama world. Lightorama is a great product, but I kind of felt I outgrew it. Jumped into xLights and haven't looked back. I have an electrical engineering background. Don't do much engineering anymore. I do mostly sales and for automation systems. Still carry my professional engineer's license. So I kind of come at this from a technical side. I think one of the great things you're going to see with sequencers are there's a lot of different types out there. There's people who are technical. There's people who are more artistic. You look at Ron Howard and Tom Bettengeorge. They come from music backgrounds. It's a really great, and I think you see a lot of differences in sequences. And then I started professionally sequencing in 2009, and it's I do it. It's not a full time project for me, but I enjoy doing it, and I've met a lot of great people. I like to put this slide in almost all my presentations because I really think sequencing is an art. It is it's like anything we do. It gives you the ability to create and do a lot of different things. I'm going to stop my video just so I don't lose bandwidth. Tom Bettengeorge did a really cool thing a few years ago. He actually took four sequences and put them on a screen by four different people of the same song, and they look totally different. And that's the key. It's like if you give somebody paint and paintbrushes, we're all going to paint differently. We're all going to use different strokes. We're all going to use different colors. In the end, we're going to have a product that we want and are proud of. And then my disclaimer, obviously, these are all just my opinions. There's a lot of different ways to do things. And this is just kind of using me as a resource for what we go through. Um, so what do I look for when I start a sequence? So obviously, you have to think about what the sequence is about. what is it going to be Halloween, Christmas? Thing I'm seeing that's interesting, and actually doing a couple of small projects right now where people are actually doing backyard parties. They're putting their props. They want to have a graduation party, or they want to have a summer party, and they're setting up light shows for their for entertaining. I think that's really cool. Colors are important when you look at sequences, and I put the spelling of colors for both our European and as well as our American people. What I do a lot of times when I look at color schemes is I'll go out and look at album art. I'll go look at videos. I did a sequence for Kelly Clarkson, Underneath the Tree, and I found out she had a Christmas ornament collection, and I took her color scheme from her Christmas ornament collection, and that's what I used for this sequence. And I think it's good to have varying colors. You don't, otherwise all your sequences start looking alike. Everybody uses red, green, and blue, and I kind of stuck with that in the sequence I'm doing today just because it's simple. But I think going through and understanding having different colors is really important. And we'll talk a little bit about timing tracks, because when you're sequencing, those are one of the most important things to have to help you guide laying down the effects. And then looking at the peaks and valleys. So I am not a musical person. I have zero musical talent, but I looking at songs, if you research kind of what a song does, typically songs kind of have an intro, and then there's a verse and a chorus, and they kind of escalate. And then there's usually at the last part, kind of the finale or the statement of the music or the statement of the sequence. So you want to, when you sequence and program, you don't, you never want to show it at the beginning. What you really want to do at the beginning of a sequence is you want to draw the audience in, but you don't want to give everything. You don't want to put the whole house effect on right from the beginning, because then they're just going to get, there'll be nothing to follow after that. And so that's why I say finish strong. And I use the whole house effect candidate, but when I do sequences, I like to sequence every single group and prop differently, especially when I do it for my customers, but it's a great way to start. So I think the other thing people, when they get into sequencing, especially if you're new to this, is xLights can be undaunting. I mean, there's a lot to it. There's a lot of different things. I really recommend for new sequencers and people coming in to keep it simple and try not to over sequence at the beginning, and just learn the fundamentals. You'll go out there and see these displays, and high density props have really made it harder, because there's so much more you can do with them. In the Lightorama days, my first display, I had 10 plastic snowmen in a bowling pin arrangement with a light in that I turned on and off. And I thought that was the greatest thing since sliced bread. It was really funny looking back at my first show versus what we do with pixels now. And it's really evolved. So today in this presentation, like I said, I'm doing kind of a two-part, and the sequence we're going to be using, we're going to kind of break it in two parts, where it's kind of have more of a simple part, and then come back tonight when I do the 201 version, and we'll expand about what we talk about today. But you have a lot of colors, and there's 51 effects. Now, within these effects, a lot of these effects have varying things that you can change to make them do different things. So when you start looking at all the different things you can do, it's huge. So what I tell people to do is understand the basics. So what we're going to do is the first half of this sequence is going to use nothing but the on effect, the single line, which is probably one of the most used effects, the fill effect, and the color wash. And we're going to talk a little bit about rendering and models, because I think understanding rendering at this point is something that people don't necessarily do. They'll hear the concept, they'll know there's a button. All rendering means in xLights is that when I take an effect and I put it in xLights, xLights looks at that effect and says, okay, I'm going to put it on my model, in this case, candy canes. So it does its magic in the background and puts that effect on the candy canes. So that's what we mean when we talk about rendering. Now, there are things we can do in here to alter the rendering. If you think of a voice where I put my voice in through a speaker, there's things I can digitally do to that voice to make it sound different. xLights does the same thing. But when you first start sequencing, don't get too hung up on that, and try not to get too caught up into what we're talking about. So I'm going to run through a couple of the basics here, and then we'll jump over into the the sequence. Now, the sequence I chose, everybody's heard it. I used Wizards because I think everybody is familiar with it. And quite frankly, I think it actually is a very good song for beginners because it has a very definite beat and very definite time sync. And I think it's easy to apply some of these basics and follow along. Okay. Now, I'm not gonna touch much on layouts and modeling. So this is I chose a smaller display for this presentation because I don't want people to get too inundated with a lot of different props and things. And you can go through and you can look. I'm not going to run through these, line by line, but a lot of these props are grouped together like you would see in a lot of people do. Now, when you can do, I like a combination of individual programming and groups. I think when you first start sequencing, just programming in groups is good because you don't have to worry about 50 million things. You can worry about 5 groups. So instead of trying to program each candy cane differently and each snowflake, do them in the group. Now, 2 things that I think are also fundamental that a lot of people miss when they start sequencing is understanding what a model is and what a model does. There are native models, and I'm going to get into more depth of this tonight. I just want to point a couple things out for the basics of sequencing when we start a sequence. These models up here that xLights have are what we call native models. They're models that Keith and everybody have predefined what they look like in xLights. And then there's things like custom models. So I'm going to use a snowflake as an example. If you look at a snowflake, and it may be hard to see, I can't minimize this to the point where it'll look in, but basically what xLights does is it builds a box, and all these numbers are basically pixels, and that's what xLights sees. And you can, if I'm right now, I'm right clicking here on node layout, it will show you the same thing. These are your node numbers, and this is how that snowflake is wired. And xLights looks at everything in a grid, okay? We're a native model, and I'll show this again later, but what they do in the arches and stuff is they do a little bit different. An arch is actually considered a straight line. So if I were to draw this custom and make an XY grid of it, it would act differently than just putting a straight line across. And I'll show an example of that in a minute and what that means. So the layout of xLights too, this is all preference. I'm on a widescreen monitor, so I can put everything on. I typically program on a setup where I have a laptop and 2 monitors. So I have a way of spreading everything out. But for this class and trying to get everything so you guys can see it, I have the house preview here, which I'll typically have off on another monitor. There's the model preview screen. And then these are usually the boxes in xLights I work with constantly. So there's a layer blending box, and we're going to not touch much of that until tonight. The color palette box, which is something that you're going to use quite a bit. We'll talk a little bit about these layer settings, but again, tonight we'll get in. But the other important one is the effect setting. So anytime you put an effect down, there is going to be a set of parameters that are adjusted for that effect. And that one you're going to want to keep handy all the time because you're ultimately going to be changing that a lot. So let's get into the programming part and what's important. So when you set up xLights and set up your models and set up your groups, if you look up at the view, there's always something called a master view, and then you can have other views set up depending on your preferences. The master view is probably the most important because this defines how your models and how your groups are going to be rendered. In the xLights world, xLights starts at the top for groups and works its way down. So let me show you what I mean by that. Oops, let me move over because I'm over. I'm going to put a fan on the whole display, and you can see that fan's going around on the whole display. What xLights is going to do is if I put another effect down here, it's going to start at the top and then it's going to work its way down and it's going to say, I want, it's going to process the effects differently. So I'm going to pick pink just so it stands out. So if you look, even though those spinners are in my whole display, because I put an effect down here, it's overriding what's going on up top here. Okay. And this is important to understand because in other views, I can change this order, but the master view is going to keep this defined. And a lot of people run into problems with this. So when you set up your sequence and you're setting up xLights, pay attention to the master view because this is going to be how the order on how things are going to be built in your sequence. So if you put a sequence on the whole display, but you want your spinners to do something different, then it needs to be higher in the order than the spinners. If the spinners are above the display, then what's going to happen is you're going to put this on the spinners and then they're going to get overwritten by the main display. So that's what we call the rendering order of the models and the rendering order of the elements that you have coming in. So the other thing that's important is group versus individual rendering and modeling. Okay, so when you put I'm going to open this up. So when I put this on an individual snowflake, this is a pinwheel and it's spinning in circles and it's doing exactly what I want it to do on the snowflake. Okay, but when I put it on a group, what xLights is doing in a group versus an individual model is that it's putting that whole group in a grid versus the individual snowflake. And you can tell if you're in a group by this little symbol, there's a musical note with some color around it. That's telling me that this is a group versus if you look at an individual. And what I did was I double clicked on that to open it and I can close it because I can see what's in the group. So I can program it at the group, or if I just want to put an effect on an individual snowflake, I can come down here and do that. Okay. So you have this on the group, and this is something that can get very elaborate. So what I ask you to do is at the beginning, when you're first sequencing, don't get into too many of the details of how the different styles work. But there is an area where wrong one. We're over here, we say render style. Okay. And you can see it's on default. So I'm on top of a group. It's at default. You can open this and remember what I was telling you, how xLight, like if we were talking through a digital box, we could go and change our voice to sound like different things. This box is basically that digital box. And what it does is it allows us to do all kinds of things. What I'm going to tell you is ignore all of this. The only thing right now you really want to worry about when you're working with groups is you want to tell it to render per default. Now what it's going to do is it's going to treat each one of those models. And if you looked at what I hit, it says per model, per default, or per model, per display. In this case, it'll work the same way. What it's done is it's saying, okay, even though I'm putting the pinwheel on a group, I'm telling xLights to put that pinwheel on each individual item in that group. So because they're all the same, they're all going to act the same. Okay. So that's important when you look at groups versus individuals. Now, just to show you that there's a difference, and I'm going to go into more depth on some of these tonight, but I don't want to get it too, I'm trying to keep things basic for you here as a beginner's presentation. When you look at some of the render styles as an individual, it actually looks different because this is an individual prop. You're not going to worry about any of these. This all has to do with 3D and other things. Until you get into advanced sequencing, you're never going to use these. The only ones you're really going to use are default, per preview, and single line. And I'm not going to cover single line too much right now because I think it's a more advanced topic. So typically you're just going to say default or per preview. And tonight I'll get into more depth on some differences, but for right now, assume that default and per preview work pretty much the same on individual props. Now, arches tend to be something that throw people a little bit. So, and I'll point this out here just for sequencing if you're new to xLights. Up here above the list, there's a place where you can do views. You can go in and create different views. So if you look, I have a lot of different views when I program, and then I created a couple of views for this class, and one of them is arches. So in this view, I can put just the arches in it and be able to just see a certain place. And I do this a lot when I sequence because it's when you get into larger displays and you have a lot of different props, especially matrices and high definition props, I like to break those out so that I can just see that group, because I'll have multiple layers and multiple things going on, and this screen will fill up really quickly, and it's just an easy way for me to keep tabs on everything. But arches tend to be a unique thing. So xLights has an arch model, and I've had a lot of customers run into issues with this, just trying to understand the difference. You can go in and put an individual arch down, tell it how many pixels there are, and it will create this arch model for you. And in this case, I have 4 individual arches. I have arch 1, arch 2, 3, and 4. And then I put them in a group called arches. xLights also gives you the ability to lay one model down and say, I have 4 arches of 30 nodes, and it will be treated as one group of arches. And a lot of people use this method, and there's nothing wrong with it. One way isn't better than the other, except when you're sequencing. Like if you import someone's sequences or you're using someone else's sequence, you have to understand the nuance between an individual prop and the groups. So let me show you what I mean. I've got the single line effect going, and what the single line effect does is it just draws a single line across an object. So in this case, it's going red, blue, and green. Because these arches are it's considered in a group, it's treating the group as one long line. Okay. If I put this same effect down on the arches group, which was this one down here, it does something completely different. It treats each one of these arches individually, and it's stacking them in a row. Okay. So what happens is sometimes people have their arches set up the first way and are expecting it to look like this. And so what we have to do is, going back to what we did for our rendering style, because it's a default, I have to go per model per default. Now I get the same look. And that's some of the nuances of modeling. And we could probably spend 2 hours on modeling and submodeling and the details of that. So, but the idea for you in this class is to keep things very simple, learn the basics, learn to walk before we run. And again, this was a case of the native models versus custom. So let's jump into some of these basic effects and talk about them a little bit to see the differences. Now, the on effect, people look at it and say, well, what does it do? It just turns things on, right? Well, that's true, but the on effect actually has several different things that you can do with it. So up here, we can see we're on the on effect. We have the ability to have a start intensity and an end intensity. So let's say I wanted it to be at 100% and go to 0. And I got to put 1 in the count. Now you can see how the color changed on here, where it's going light to dark, and you can see the props that we have going on there changing colors. We can go the opposite and do the opposite. You can also use the sliders if you want. I tend to like the type in because it's just easier. And then I can also play with the cycle count. So, and this is very important, because if I'm going to put the on effect over, and we're going to look at this in a minute in the sequence, if I want to beat, I can line up the number of counts to the beat lines. And we'll talk about that when we open up the sequence. So even the on effect has a lot of things that it can change to make it unique to what you want. Obviously, you can also pick the color. Now, what I found with the on effect is you can pick as many of these as you want. It's always going to pick the first color to the left. So even though I might have multiple colors picked. Oops, I need to put that at 1 because I have it's kind of at 100. It's always going to take whatever the first one on the left is. So you could have multiples picked, but it's going to ignore everything to the right of it. Okay. And then you can also, and we won't get into this much here, but you can actually make this transparent as well. And that comes into play. There's a great class coming up today on layering. I recommend it because we're going to build off of that a little bit tonight. And I think it's a more advanced concept for sure. But layering, when you do transparency and stuff, that's where layering can come into play. Another one I like is the color wash. And the color wash does a couple things. So I don't like a lot of hard edges in my sequences. And even though the Wizards one we're going to look at has a lot of hard edges, I tend to like to soften the look up. And the color wash gives us the opportunity to do that. So what color wash does is it allows me to pick several colors, and then over time, it's going to run through those colors. Oops, I got this. So in the case where I've got, let's do red, green, and blue. It starts with red, transitions to green, and transitions to blue. Now, it'll also allow you to make that palette circular. So it'll start red, sequence through, and then come back red. But the thing I really like about the effect is that you can make it go into color fade. So you can fade it on the vertical to where it kind of feathers out to the top, and you can feather it off into the horizontal. And in a lot of sequences, when you're going for emotion, or you've got a sequence that maybe isn't as hard beating, or that softer look actually fits the story of what the sequence or of the song that you're trying to do. And then you can also shimmer if you need the effect. I don't use the shimmer much. There's another tool up here that we won't get into today because I can control the values of this shimmer, where this one, it just kind of does it based on however many counts that xLights decides to do it. And then let's look at the fill display is another good one that I think a lot of people overlook. And it's actually a pretty interesting. So what the fill effect does is, and I've got a matrix here. This is usually the best way to show this. The fill effect will take all the colors that you select, start top to bottom, and kind of give you this rainbow look. So depending on what colors I pick, you can pick 2 colors, you can pick 3. If you wanted, more bands, you can go and put red, green, red, green, red, green, and make those selections. And it gives you the ability to fill something with color. Now, the great thing about this is that you have this slider called position, and what it allows us to do is fill that space based on where that slider is. So if I have it at 100, it fills the whole thing. If I put it down at 10, only 10% of the matrix. And we'll show why this is useful when I run you through the sequence. And it allows you to do some manipulations with the colors and placement so that you can create effects. And in Wizards, we're going to show you how that's done, to the beats that are going on. Some of these other things, band size and skip, I'm not going to get into. I don't use them hardly at all. They're kind of specialty places. So on the fill, the big thing is to look at the slider bar. And then one thing you can't see on the screen here, I'm going to move. Bear with me here for a minute. Is direction. So the other thing the fill allows us to do is it gives us the ability to do direction. So we can go up, we can go down, we can go left and right. Okay. And it just creates the colors. And I'm going to show you, there's a part in the sequence where I even use that to create a little bit of a feel in the sequence. Okay. And then the single line. Now the single line is probably one of the most used effects that you're going to find when you sequence, especially at the beginning. It has a lot of versatility. There's a lot of different things you can do with it. Obviously, it looks great on arches, but it does look good on other effects. Now, the reason I'm putting it on a matrix right now is so that you kind of understand what the single line does. What the single line does is, I'm going to try to slow this down here so you can kind of see it. The single line will It's not running across the display. It basically fills in a straight line all the pixels from top to bottom. Okay. So in this case, I have these colors picked. So it starts from right to left on the colors and it puts them in order. And that basically in a matrix, it will fill all the pixels down below. If this were a single line, it would fill a single line of pixels up, with the same color pattern. But what's neat about the single line is you have a large variety of things that you can do with this effect that create some really unique things. And we're going to show this in the wizard sequence in a minute. But I can adjust the thickness of those bars by the chase size. I can also put more than one set. Now things can get really crammed really quick. If I put two, let's take the number of colors down for a minute just so you can kind of see. Again, I don't like hard edges. You have the ability to put a 3D effect. So what it does is it kind of bleeds the edges out for you. But the other thing is you have a lot of different chase types. So I can go left to right. I can go right to left. You can bounce left to right. You can bounce right to left. Let's put that back to 1. A dual chase will give you kind of a dual image. And then you can go to the middle and you can go from the middle. And then you can bounce in the middle. So we'll show how this works on some props, but again, the single line gives you a lot of different options and a lot of different things. I'm not going to get into the skips and the band sizes and stuff because that's kind of a more advanced technique, and there's certain times when you'll use that, but we're not going to go into that in depth today. So let's look real quick on arches, and then we're going to jump into the sequence here. So with the single line, what's cool is a lot of times you're going to see people's arches bouncing back and forth to the music, right? So what we're doing here is we put the effect. Now I have it broken down per model. So, per model default. And then I have bounced left to right. If I do a dual chase, it'll go and give us a dual chase. So as we make these changes, we can go just left and we can go just right. So we have the ability to go, and then we can also, if I have this overall bunch of timing marks, I can make this, go to 4 or 6 and make it beat with the music. And we'll go through that in a minute. So those are the basics. And these are probably the go-to effects that I tell people to use when you're first doing sequencing on your own. Because once you master these concepts, then you can make it to the next level, do some of the things we're going to talk about tonight. And then you can get into the more advanced sequencing techniques where you get into some of the really interesting. Now, to just give you an idea, when I sequence the wizard sequence I'm going to put up here is I probably put about 5 or 6 hours into to get this to a point where it's going to tell the story I want it to tell for the class. My sequences, when I do them, if you look at something I'll produce, or if I do for someone else's display, I'll spend 30 to 40 hours. My rule of thumb is usually 8 to 10 hours a minute of song to really do it the way I want to do it. Because you will never see me use the whole house effect hardly at all. You won't see me use the all display effect hardly at all. I like to tell the story, and I like to bring everything in to the into the story and control it, because I think it makes the display look even better. Now, if you've just joined, the presentation or came in after, this sequence will be available. It is available for free. You go up to my website, go to Virtual Christmas and hit it. You're not asked to give any information or anything. You can download this sequence as it is, and then you can use it or, review it, go through some of the things as we go through the class. Now, what I want to talk a little bit about are timing marks and things that you put into a sequence. So there is, when you first create a sequence and put it down, and you haven't you brought your music in and you haven't laid any effects down yet, you want to go in and add timing marks. So what you do is, when you have this, you right click up here where your timing marks is, and I can add a timing mark. Now there is a plugin that you can get on the xLights website. If you go to xlights.org, on the front page, it's a thing called the Queen Mary plugins. And there's a procedure on xLights on how to install that. When you first install xLights, you won't see any of these features down here. You'll only see empty, metronome, 150, and 25 millisecond. What these do is I can put timing marks every 100 milliseconds. I can pick a cut. Metronome allows me to do a custom, so if I want them every half second. What the Queen Mary plugins give you is the ability to put in these bar and beat trackers, and note onsets, and some of the other types of timing marks that'll automatically generate. I use quite a bit the beat tracker. So if you look up here, that's what I put. This is a 4-count song, so the beat tracker goes in and puts these beats down automatically for us, and then it allows us to kind of line things up on the music. Another one that I will add and use a lot of, and I didn't put it in here, is the note onset detector, because that automatically goes in and picks note onsets into the sequence. So when you start getting into more elaborate sequencing where you really want to break down things and have things do different things on different timings, these timing marks are important. The other thing that the timing marks do for you is if you go into the settings, whoops, let me go up here. Is it preferences? And go to the effects grid. I make sure that I have snap to timing marks set. Okay, so this is in your preferences in xLights, because what that's going to do is when I drag an effect down into the programmer, it automatically will put it into the timing marks, in between the timing marks for me. If not, then what happens is it gets placed wherever you put the pointer, and then you've got to kind of move it around. Now, it doesn't mean that you can't move it after you put it down, but it at least puts it into the area where you want it. The other thing I find really helpful, and this was a feature that xLights added probably a couple of years ago, is the waveform of the music, because you can kind of see from the waveform where things happen. Okay, so they go through and you'll see peaks and valleys and see a lot of things. Now, I'm going to play the first minute or so. The sound sometimes will sound sometimes will come through. Sometimes you'll get an echo, but I want to play the first minute so you can kind of see what the sequence looks like. And then we're going to talk about how we achieved some of those things. So again, this is Wizards in Winter. I think just about everybody in the lighting community has heard it at one point in time or another. So here we're kind of beginning the song, and we get into our first chorus. Okay, so in the beginning, through that sequence, and hopefully the sound came out enough that you guys could at least hear some of it, there's a lot of the basic techniques we talked about. Now, I threw some Megatree and Matrix stuff in here. We're not going to talk about that. I could do a 2-hour presentation on just programming a Matrix or a Megatree. But the key to the beginning of this sequence is I want to show you some of the techniques we just talked about when you get into. Let me check the sound time here. Okay, we're at 20 minutes because I want to leave you guys a few minutes to ask questions. But so like on the on effect, you heard the beginning where there's 2 beats here. What we did was we laid the on effect down, and then we actually put in the effect setting down here, I put 2 beats, right? So I said, let's go from 100 to 0, boom, boom. Okay, so that's how we're getting that beat look. And so the on effect allows you to kind of go to the beats in these timing marks. Now, I can see from a peak and a valley that there's 2 beats in here when you listen to it. So I just said, okay, we're gonna go in there. We're gonna hit it twice. Now, sometimes you're gonna have an offbeat. This one had an offbeat. You can kind of see where it started, and that's why these sound graphs help you, because this effect I lined up on the 2 beats here, even though, because it doesn't end up on a timing mark. And all I do is I'm clicking my mouse on this with the and holding the button, and I can move this effect wherever I want. Okay. Now, the other thing I did was when you're trying to get effects is I've put this on groups. So I've put this on the snowflakes, and maybe I picked yellow. The spinners I made blue, and the candy canes and stuff I made green. So it just kind of to break up the colors and give you some idea of what's going on. The other thing is when you run through, so when we went through, let's go to the course for a minute. Okay, so here I'm using the single line a lot, and that, now you're getting a kind of a really nice drastic effect on the whole display. So all I did here was I put the single line on the horizontals of the house, and I put them across the mark here. So I know they're going across here. We have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12 beats going across here. If you listen to the song, it's bum, 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 bum on every one of these marks. So what I wanted was I wanted this to bounce back and forth to that beat. So there's 12 beats. Because it bounces back and forth, I went and put 6 in here. So it's going to move these 6 times and kind of stay in the beat. If I wanted to do I just wanted to go bounce back and forth, if you can see on how that one's just bouncing back and forth, you can do it that way. It's all preference on how you want to lay it out. But the key is, look, especially with the single line, is I want to look at the beats on the count. So like if I look at the arches here, if I wanted those arches to go back and forth, I can do that. I can bounce it. Whoops. They'll bounce back and forth to the beat. Okay. Now, the key to understanding this is when we say bounce left to right is that it's going to bounce left to right in one, however many times I tell it to. So if I set this to 1, it's only going to bounce once through this whole time period. So if I set it up like this, let's just do 1 beat where it's going back and forth now. That it went back and forth 1 time on that beat. So it went, okay, so I went back. I could copy this multiple times if I want. That's kind of a pain. So that's why if you take it out and you make it 6, it's going to perform the same task. And then I'm just doing it in one effect versus multiple. And the same thing with putting it on like the candy canes down here. I just ran it across the candy canes. Now, later on in the sequence, I do some things that we'll talk about tonight that are going to make this more, we're going to do more definition in the props and make it look really different. Again, here's on effects as this thing is thumping. It's going bump, 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 bump. We're going to ignore the trees and the matrices. I just wanted to put something in there for you to go in. So here's another one where the fill effect kind of comes in. So see how I've got the multiple colors on the candy canes. And what I did was, like on the house, I've put, let's go down here. Where the candy canes are, I put the fill effect and I put white and red on them, and I'm getting that white and red effect on there, okay? So that allows us to play around with colors. If I put it on the whole house display, which I did in a lot in this, or the house face decor, it keeps the color schemes going across. So where I wanted to get to was, here's using fill position. Okay, so here in the song is where I'm using the fill to kind of do something unique. See how that's doing that step to the beat? All I did was, for each of these beats up here, and you can kind of see them up here, I took the fill and I said, okay, I broke that into 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. I know there's 5 beats. So I said, let's go 15%. So the first one I put at 15 for the height, the next one at 30, next one at 45, 60, 75, and 100. So that's how we get this effect where we're climbing the ladder. Okay. I'm going to show a different way to do that tonight, but the fill effect again gives us the ability to kind of tell the story or tell something a little bit different for you. Okay. So as you go through, I'd encourage you to look at some of these things. I put some headings in here so you can kind of go in and say, okay, hey, it's using the fill effect in this area. What's he doing? Now here's another area I didn't play too much with you, but it's going to kind of lead into what we're going to do tonight. I put in some of those basics, but you can kind of see now I'm playing around a little more with color, the single line. I'm doing some different techniques on the props, and we'll go through some of this tonight to kind of show you how to go to the next level after mastering some of these display elements. So the big thing to learn or take away from this particular segment is to really, when you're first starting, to try to stay with the basics, understand how all these pieces fit together, and then take it to the next step. Then you can start worrying about, are there things I can do where I can kind of put two effects together on something. It's what we call layering. So I think Ron Howard's got a layering class coming up either right after this or this morning. Definitely watch that. I'll build on that a little bit. I'll show some basic layering techniques tonight later on in the sequence. But you will find that if you step through these, xLights won't be as overwhelming, because a lot of people go out and get a purchase sequence for somebody, and they'll see all these different effects being used, and there's 50 million layers, and it is overwhelming. And I encourage it. I mean, some people learn differently. I mean, some people learn very quickly. Some, it's a slower process. So, you do what you feel. There's a lot of information out there. There's a lot of videos out there. What I find though is people sometimes jump over to these basics, and some of this stuff is really going to set the foundation of what you do and how you do it when you set up a sequence. So I've run up to about 10 minutes to the end of the session, so I'd like to leave it open to see. I have not been monitoring chat, so I don't know if there were any questions that came out, but if there's something somebody would like to ask, or if there's a question, that I can kind of put together for you, feel free to either raise your hand or post it in chat, and I'll try to answer it for you. Oh, someone did put. Okay. Yeah, somebody posted the URL in the chat, by the way, for those of you who want the URL. And I'm going to leave that active for for a while, because they'll post these videos, and I'm sure people are watching the video and want to go download that sequence. So it'll be out there, for people to get. And I will say, no questions don't be afraid to ask. I think people get intimidated sometimes thinking that everybody knows even the basics, but you're going to find they don't. So, don't be afraid to ask.
I do have one, if I may. It's about actually creating those timing marks. Is there a best practice or an easy way of creating those while listening to the song?
So you can, I didn't touch on it, but you can actually do a custom. So some songs have some really weird things. So I'll just create an empty timing track, and I'll call, and sometimes in my sequences, you'll see it a working track. I already had one, so I'll call it working 2. When you start playing, or if you put your marker, if you hit the T key, whoops, it went to the end of the song there. You can put timing tracks. Like if I want a timing track in that section, I just did something wrong here. I think what it did was it put it on the hole where I stopped the song. Here, let me try this again. So let's say I have a range in the song where I want to put a timing track. I can highlight it, like just this part, and hit T, and it will put a timing track in that segment. So The automatic ones work pretty good. I would say if the song has a regular beat, go into the beat counter. So you can lay down the timing track, pick the beats, and then it may not let me do it. And then you can actually tell it. I almost always go with the 4. You can put 8 or 16 to get more definition if you want. So I'll use the standard ones, but I do a lot of custom, because what I'll do is listen to the song and tap that T key as the song goes along, and then I'll adjust those timing marks to line up on the music. So I would say start with the standard, and then if you need timing marks that you feel like it, sometimes, like, it's a sequence I just did with Snoopy where there's a drum beat. I actually went in and created the timing marks for all the drum beats because I put an image in for the drum beat. So I just put I had a section where I only put timing marks in for that section and called it drum beats. So hopefully I answered your question. I kind of jumped around a little bit there.
No, thank you. That's fine.
Hey, is there a way to basically, if you have timing marks, to make the cycles automatically set to the numbers of timing marks within that time frame?
Well, the only way to do it is to go into custom and create, set the metronome up for the number of milliseconds you want. So, okay. So yeah. So otherwise you either have to do them manually, or the other one that I use a lot is the note onset, but it will get what it'll do is it'll go through. Yeah, I already have a note onset. Oh, I have it right here. Okay. What it'll do with notes onset, and you can kind of see, because it'll put, when you, I guess I should have pointed that out on the timing marks. If you want them to show up, you pick the radio button on the ones you want to work with. Okay. So in this case, I picked note onsets, but if you look in more complicated songs, these onsets, you get a lot of them out there. And I find sometimes they're useful to work with and sometimes they're not. There's just too many of them. And I go in and either do custom ones or I'll just line stuff up. But the timing marks are one of the most important things because it just helps you line everything up. I've seen people try to sequence with no timing marks and they're trying to put this stuff down, and it's just making your life a lot harder.
But you can't assign cycles to timing marks, right? You have to manually do it?
Yes.
Okay.
That I know of. And there may be a way, I'm not 100% aware.
All right, thank you.
So how did you get the, on the beats, the other options other than the default?
So you go to the xLights website here. Let's go ahead and do this real quick. I just gotta make sure I don't run into, we got about 5 minutes because the next presenter will come in. If you go down here, is it here or downloads? Let's go to downloads. So you go to downloads, you see this thing called Queen Mary Q Vamp plugins. You click on that and download that, and you install it, and then that'll put the plugins into xLights. And if you look somewhere on here, there's some instructions to do that. And that's how you get those what we call the Queen Mary plugins, and those are the ones that are different, that are the add-ons besides just the 250 millisecond and the metronome.
Perfect, thank you.
Yep. Okay, not a problem. Like I said, I'll be around tonight. I'm on Facebook. If people have questions, message me. I appreciate everybody attending the session today.
Thank you, Barry. Thank you for your time.
Thank you very much.